Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of DarshanTalks. We have Kate Melton. Stay tuned for her to tell you more about who she is, why she's amazing, why Mary Poppins is just a pale representation of what she actually is. And to be clear, I think Mary Poppins also was in charge of 3 kids.
This is the DarshanTalks podcast. Regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at DarshanTalks or the show's website at DarshanTalks.com.
So, Kate, talk a little bit more about yourself.
So Kate Melton, definitely not Mary Poppins, because she was only in charge of 2 children.
Oh, is that what it was?
That it was 2.
Like I said, better in every way.
I am, my background is I have a PhD in pharmacology. I went to business school. I've been on drug discovery teams, worked in clinical trials, got drugs approved. I've worked on the business side in marketing, business development, and payer interactions. And I've also worked with entrepreneurial groups in the innovation space. Currently, I am the head of commercial for Navigate Biopharma, which is a Novartis subsidiary, and we specialize in developing clinical diagnostics and companion diagnostics for oncology products.
So, Kate, what I want to do is I want to pick on something you said earlier in your introduction. And what you talked about was your experience with drug development. Mm-hmm. And we've recorded a podcast, and hopefully it's going to come out in the right order. But the last podcast we recorded, we talked about the idea that drug development may be impacted by pharmacogenomics. And you know what? One of the things we actually didn't do, and this is kind of late in the game, but we're going to do this anyways. How do you define pharmacogenomics?
I define pharmacogenomics as looking at the genetic background of an individual and working out if they will process a drug differently, respond to a drug differently. So it will give you information as how they will respond to a chemical that is introduced to their body, and hopefully that information will be able to help you dose them better or not dose them if they should not be receiving a drug.
Which really takes us back to that whole discussion we were about to have on drug development. If pharmacogenomics holds that promise, do you believe that the FDA is going to incorporate this either in the actual drug development process like we discussed early on, or do you think that you see a future where the FDA goes, you know what, you are a pre-existing drug, but the science has changed around you. What we expect is for you to actually do some pharmacogenomic testing and identify if your drug is more responsive in certain populations, and either make that as part of a REMS in the future or as part of some kind of conditional approval. What do you think?
Okay, so the FDA approve drugs based upon the knowledge that is available to them at that moment. That means that, 10 years from now, they might have made a different decision if additional data, if they knew what they knew now. I think that they will continue to approve drugs based upon the best data available. And moving forward, I think they might start to ask for, have you done the appropriate studies into pharmacogenomics, and how much of your population for which you're going for a certain indication should respond to your drug? I think they're going to start to ask for that. Is it currently necessary for everything? Absolutely not. I think in the future, let's say you start seeing adverse events, safety suggestions that from a safety perspective, a certain subgroup of patients should not be receiving a drug. They may then go back and say, hey, right now, if we're going to give you a black box warning unless you go and look into X. I think that might be something they look at in the future, but they might not make you do it on every drug being approved right now. Do I think that it's something that they should be doing in the future? I personally think so, yes, because the FDA is an agency which taxpayers essentially pay for, and they are there to protect us and make sure that physicians do no harm. And if they can provide the appropriate guidance to make sure that drugs do not harm patients and only do good, they should absolutely be doing it.
But that really takes us to the question of which subset of drugs. And I think there's a whole conversation we should have on physicians and what is the role of healthcare practitioners in this. But before we get into that whole process, let's talk a little bit about the types of drugs. You're talking about the drug approval process, and you're talking about as a drug gets closer, whether we're going to do a black box warning or the like. Do you think that the FDA should go back and start looking at drugs that were already approved and say that the science has changed around you? We're going to reconsider. And they've done that with things like opioids, for example.
Right. And so I think, we luckily live in an age where there's a huge amount of data. There's now, more artificial intelligence than you can imagine what to do with. And the capability to look at a bunch of retrospective data and pinpoint the specific either classes of drugs or specific molecules, which could potentially impact a person, is getting easier and easier. So it wouldn't surprise me if they do go back and say, hey, now in retrospect, I've seen this type of drug. Oh, there were so many safety warnings, adverse events that came in. I think you need to go back post hoc and look at this. Yes, I think that will absolutely happen, but it's not necessarily a bad thing, because if you look at, there are a number of drugs out there that right now are going through very large cardiovascular outcomes trials because the FDA want to check that you are not going to be doing harm in that area. You might not even want to go after a CV indication, but you have to run that trial anyway. Now, what if a pharmacogenomic test could actually indicate that a certain subgroup of patients would be at risk for a CV event if they were taking that product? Then that pharmacogenomic test would have actually had to stop that pharma company having to run a massive trial. So in some ways, it might be seen as extra work. I think in other ways, the pharma companies might actually see this as a cost efficiency.
It's almost a sifting process, if you will. And
it's up to the company and then the FDA how early they do the sifting process. Like if the information is available right at the very beginning, then you should probably be doing the sifting process right at the beginning.
So that really raises the question of the sifting process. You're almost thinking, at least the way I'm hearing you, we're thinking of the sifting process by branded products for the most part. Do you think this type of sifting should be taken on by generics if that science changes at that time?
I think it comes down to so we're talking about generics for which you still need a script, not over the counter, right?
Correct.
If a company is looking to generate revenue out of selling a drug, they are on the hook for making sure, first and foremost, they aren't hurting a patient. And if a pharmacogenomic test will indicate that a certain subset of patients should absolutely not be taking a drug, then they should be responsible for it. Because, what's going to happen is you might get a class action lawsuit from a group of patients or their family saying, hey, why didn't you do this? That's part of being in the drug business. You have to make sure that you're not doing any harm before you actually see any efficacy.
So you think this might be something that class action lawyers, plaintiffs' lawyers, would start looking at and going, you should have done better. This was a quote unquote design defect, and you didn't do everything you could to make sure that patients are being appropriately protected. And this might be, go ahead.
What I should have said is I should have been careful making that comment, bearing in mind I know you're a lawyer. That was not actually what I was saying at all. But now that you've mentioned it, I don't know the answer to that one right now, but I think it is actually a question that if I was a drug company, I'd be starting to look at. If I was a generic company, you're going to get a really smart person who's very good with a calculator, work out what is my risk for not doing this. Like if there is enough body of evidence out there on PubMed that suggests that a certain group of patients should not be getting your drug, you need to weigh the risk of a class action lawsuit versus doing a clinical study.
Interesting. So stay tuned. We're going to talk more about, we have Kate for a little bit longer, so I'm going to try to get her into the next podcast. Stay tuned. We're going to have her talk to us, hopefully, a little bit about HCPs and maybe even what is the appropriate way to reach out to these HCPs. Stay tuned, everyone.
This is the DarshanTalks podcast. Regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at DarshanTalks or the show's website at DarshanTalks.com.